Committee will be in order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Rules Committee. Today we're here in consideration of H.R. 1406, the Working Families Flexibility Act that gives Americans' private sector workers an option that has been available to public sector workers for over 25 years, the ability to choose comp time instead of paid overtime. In other words, flexibility. As the father of several boys, I understand the flexibility that families require to balance their time effectively, and that's why we're pleased to be here today and why I am a co-sponsor and support the work that my friend from Alabama, Congresswoman Martha Roby, and the Education Workforce Committee have done on this very important bill. And by the way, thank you for the great job that Mrs. Roby has done in educating not just members but the American public on the importance of this bill. We're here today to provide more flexibility to working Americans and their families so that they can better manage and balance the demand of family and the workplace time that they have. The bill keeps long-standing worker protections in place and simply says that if a worker determines that he or she would prefer to convert overtime hours into paid time off, he or she would be able to at least be able to negotiate to do that. And I think it's important that we consider this legislation. I consider it groundbreaking. I spent 16 years in the free enterprise system and found this during my time of working to be an option that would be available to an employee who, in some instances, valued time off more important than getting paid, because time off means that then they could pick and choose, work with their employer on the options and availabilities to do that and make that happen. As members of Congress, we understand that lots of things take place when we're in Washington. In my case, it was wrestling tournaments and football games and Special Olympic events that sometimes I missed. And I wish that I perhaps could have gone and said, give me time off where I could be at home. And other times I could do that. But it is important that employees have the flexibility, that they have an employer who would understand the opportunity and perhaps take that into consideration. And so I think what you're doing today with us as the lead sponsor of this important piece of legislation, Mrs. Roby, is outstanding. And so I am delighted that you are here today. Would the gentlewoman from New York choose to have any opening statement?
No, thank you.
Thank you very much. By the way, it is good to see you. I heard today that Rochester has better weather than we do in better weather than Washington today. It's been a while. Today we welcome two important and dignified members of Congress who have come up to talk about this, and without objection, we'll accept anything that you have in writing that will be entered in the record, and we would welcome a summary or to answer questions of any of the testimony that you wish to. I would recognize, if I could, the gentlewoman from Alabama at this time.
Thank you very much, Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member Slaughter, and all of the members of the committee this afternoon. And I appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of this committee about H.R. 1406, the Working Family Flexibility Act of 2013. And as the Chairman stated, this bill would give the private sector the ability under the Fair Labor Standards Act to do what the public sector has already been doing since 1985. And that would be to allow private employers to offer their employees compensatory time or paid time off in lieu of cash payments for overtime if and only if the employee opted for that. This is completely voluntary, meaning that by removing this regulation prohibiting it, it would give the employer the ability to offer this as a benefit to their employees. And look, I want to go to what Mr. Chairman said about being a dad. I'm a mom of two small kids, and certainly we all here represent working families, and we understand the pulls that we have. And both my husband and I work, and I can certainly relate to the juggles as a mom about getting kids to and from. And, I represent a generation now that is not just have small children, but also has aging parents. And so we can all see how the public sector that has benefited from this for so many years, that if it's good enough for them, it should be good enough for the private sector as well. The workplace has changed significantly in recent decades. I find this very interesting. In 1975, just 37% of married families with children were headed by two working parents. That number today is nearly 60%. Meanwhile, 1 in 3 college undergraduates is employed full-time, and 8.5 million workers are single parents. This, again, is why I have introduced the Working Family Flexibility Act of 2013. This bill does not alter the 40-hour work week or change how overtime is calculated. An employee who works overtime would still be compensated as is required under the Fair Labor Standards Act at the time and a half rate. The employee would just simply choose how they're compensated, with cash payments or through a voluntary agreement with their employer for that time and a half for paid time off. This is not a new concept. As I've already mentioned, the rules should not be different for the private sector as they are for the public sector. There are numerous protections for the employee to ensure that the use of compensatory time is completely voluntary. For example, the employer and the employee must enter into a written agreement from which the employee can withdraw at any time. I want to make that clear. The employee can withdraw from this agreement at any time. An employee can cash out their accrued comp time for any reason at any time. All existing enforcement remedies that are currently under the Fair Labor Standards Act would remain in place. Deciding when to use compensatory time is at the employee's discretion, not the employer. It's at the employee's discretion, so long as the reasonable notice is given, and the standard is as long as it doesn't unduly disrupt the business. This is the same standard that is currently used under the Family Medical Leave Act and other bodies of law. And it's also the same standard that is used in the public sector when they opt to use compensatory time as well. And at a recent hearing that we had on the Education and Workforce Committee, we heard from a witness who had experience in both the private and the public sector and testified that this standard has worked really well for the public employees. If the unduly disrupt standard is good enough for government agencies, it should be good enough for the private sector as well. If an employer unfairly denies an employee's use of comp time, the employee can file a complaint on their own with the Department of Labor, or the department can launch an investigation and ultimately force the employer to comply, just as it does now under current law in response to other allegations of wrongdoing under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Finally, the legislation creates strong protections against intimidation and coercion. A worker who believes that he has been forced to receive comp time instead of cash wages can file a complaint with the department or a lawsuit in federal court and receive double damages from the employer. The Working Family Flexibility Act of 2013 is just common sense. It is desperately needed policy, particularly in today's environment. Providing greater flexibility and strong protections, this legislation is going to help more Americans balance work and family life. So I urge the committee to support 1406 and a structured rule for its consideration on the House floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here. Ms. Courtney, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Your work and ideas will be well received by this committee, and I welcome you at this time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I serve with Mrs. Roby on the Education and Workforce Committee, ranking member on the Workforce Protection Subcommittee. So we've had a lively exchange over the last few weeks regarding this legislation. And again, as a parent of two and as a private sector small employer for over 20 years, this is an issue which I feel very strongly about. I, again, had the reality of staff who had family emergencies crop up, and the need to, again, have a workplace environment and a system that allows people who are employees to respond to those is critically important. And I want to begin with that point, which is that, again, as somebody who's had real-life experience with this, there is nothing in the Fair Labor Standards Act that prevents an employer from giving people time off, irregardless of this bill being enacted or not. Again, if a staff member came in to me, and this experience did happen, where a daughter had to be hospitalized because of a crisis, a mental health crisis, I told her, just go. Don't worry about, how we sort of arrange for your work or your time. An employer has that discretion today, and that's something that happens in workplaces over and over again. What this bill is focused on is setting up a system where workers are going to be confronted with a choice of whether or not they sacrifice overtime cash benefits in exchange for getting the possibility of comp time for an event that may occur sometime off in the future. It is subject to a written agreement. I mean, think about that. So that every time you want to exercise your rights under this change in law, people are going to have to sit down and execute a written agreement with, again, conditions which are laid out on page 4 of the bill. Where they're going to have to sign off on knowing and voluntary. Again, I just can't imagine a more unworkable arrangement to force people into negotiating sort of mini labor contracts every time they want to come up with an overtime arrangement. Again, for workers who are not in an overtime situation, this bill does nothing in terms of creating any kind of protection for exercising comp time. And I would just sort of respectfully disagree with the statement that was made here that the employee has the ability to exercise their comp time rights. Again, if you go to page 8 in the bill, it states very clearly it shall be permitted by the employee's employer to use such time. Again, so the decision after you've already sort of set up a written agreement to sacrifice your overtime in exchange for getting comp time for some player to be named later, some event that's going to happen in the future. The fact is that it's still subject to the employer's veto in terms of whether or not you can use that comp time at all. And that is not, in my opinion, a balance of power in terms of negotiating comp time that really is fair or balanced. And that's why over 70 organizations that represent working families, women's groups have come out strongly in opposition to this bill. Again, I give my colleague the highest marks possible for her sensitivity to this issue, which is extremely important. But the fact is that there's a whole wide range of ideas about how to create more real workplace flexibility, protect people's wages. My colleague from New Haven, Congresswoman DeLauro, has the Healthy Families Act, which would put America in the position of being finally some bare minimum paid leave for people to exercise sick time. Again, over 160 nations in the world provide that. As a matter of course, we don't. So Rosa has a bill, an amendment that she's going to be submitting to the Rules Committee to ask to be put in order. Frankly, I think we should have an open rule. I think we should debate this issue with a whole wide range about the Family and Medical Leave Act, which my constituent Chris Dodd spearheaded back in the early 1990s. Again, it's completely unpaid family and medical leave. I frankly think it's time, as many states have already moved in that direction, to open up that discussion. So again, I give nothing but the highest of praise to my colleague for the fact that she cares very deeply about this issue. But this is a flawed bill, a bill which is now being introduced for the 5th time. I mean, this legislation has been introduced and reintroduced and reintroduced 4 prior occasions, has not moved, and I think for good reasons, because I think it creates a very unworkable, awkward situation, which is an invitation to litigation, which, again, I think it's kind of ironic that we're talking about creating a new cause of action in federal court, and really making Department of Labor's, which have now a very bright line system of overtime, to have to negotiate and referee disputes about whether or not the agreement applied to this, whether I was able to, request comp time for that. I mean, the fact is it just puts a whole cloud of uncertainty around the workplace, which which, again, needs help, but not with this measure. And with that, I would yield back. Again, I've written comments, which, again, I would ask to be submitted to the record.
Without objection, we will accept both of those.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful insight. It is important as we debate these issues before the Rules Committee to understand clearly where you are and where Mrs. Roby is, and I do hear your clear distinction. I heard you say two things. Number one, I just summarize it this way, knowing what the deal is. You thought it was cumbersome to know what the deal was, to put it in writing. And secondly, you felt like it was an employer-decided arrangement, in other words, on the side of the employer. And I just have two comments as a guy that had extensive background in a large sales force, about 500 people who have varying needs. One of the things that I did want to make sure is always my management team would know what the deal was. Whatever they cut with an employee, if an employee said, hey, I do have a mental health issue, or my daughter slipped and broke her ankle, or what, I've got a softball game that I want to go to, it was always initiated by the employee. The employee always came to us. We didn't go to them and say, hey, I want to give you time off for that baseball game. It was the employee, and we wanted to make sure, or at least I told my team, you do need to know what the deal is, and you do need to put it in writing so that we understand what the employee said and what we said. Them sign it, darn right. Us sign it at least by our managers or supervisors, yeah, so that we knew what the deal was to where we weren't agreeing to something and couldn't live up to it. I think that's a powerful attribute, knowing what the deal is. Secondly, employer decided, well, it's a request from an employee. Management may come and say, we need you to work, and generally speaking, everybody understands the needs of the business. Might be because it's a period of time. It might be because it's a big deal to their business. But there are periods of time when business, I think, advises people, and as a regular course of action, they understand we're going to have to work overtime. And I think given that opportunity to an employer then say, but not during that time. You can have time off, maybe come in early to work now, just flexibility. So I think that the two things that you have highlighted as a guy that had vast experience of dealing with huge numbers, 500 employees, knowing the deal was important and being able to take a request from an employee and the employer be able to say, let's negotiate, I think is a powerful attribute. So thank you for being here, at least to understand what your feelings were or objections about that. I don't know if I've said anything. I don't know if I'm asked a question, but that's what I heard you say. Did I get any of it wrong?
Obviously, we see it differently, but
I do agree with that.
Respect the fact that you have a
But I
point of
boiled
view.
it down to that.
Yes.
Knowing the deal,
Yeah.
and then the employer taking a request and being able to work with them on that. Thank you very much. Mrs. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our colleagues from the Education and Workforce Committee for being here. Congresswoman Roby, I was struck by something. I'm not an attorney. I know you are, but I always thought the word shall didn't give anybody any leeway. Mr. Courtney said, by reading the comment he made about shall, that it left it open to the employer to decide whether or not to do this. Would you like to comment on that?
Right. Well, I think what Mr. Courtney said, and thank you for pointing that out, was that, and I wrote this down, that there was a choice of sacrificing one for the other. And you're exactly right. There's a choice, and it is the employee's choice to determine which is more important, time or paid time off. Now, several things that I think are important protections to circle back to on that. When the employer comes, and this is to your point as well, Mr. Courtney is concerned about this being in the control of solely the employer to determine, and this unduly disrupt standard that is the same standard throughout other bodies of law, including the Family Medical Leave Act. But there's a Sixth Circuit opinion that narrowly tailors that, and there's a narrow interpretation. There has to be clear and affirmative evidence that the employer rejected the employee's request. So again, a very narrow determination there. But more importantly than just even that is the fact that if an employer says to an employee, you've accrued this time, you've asked me for this time off, and because of the nature of our business and what we make, it just doesn't fit for the time that you've requested. But we can look at alternative dates. So let's say that's the conversation that takes place. If in fact that happens and the employer said, well, no, my child's spring break is that week, that's the time I planned for, but if I can't use that time, then the employee can always cash out at any time for any portion of the accrued compensatory time. So if the employee has banked this compensatory time and it doesn't work out because it's during a busy season or it's Christmas time and they're in a retail setting, the employee can always say, I want my money that I accrued. And at that time, within the 30 days, as under the bill, the employer must remit the time and a half in overtime that employee has earned. So there are several protections in place that deal with that. It is not at the employer's the employer does not get to set this. This is at the option of the employee, and the unduly disrupt standard is very narrowly construed.
It looks to me like it's a win-win for employees.
It would be a win-win for employees because it's a benefit that an employer can confer to their employee, and then at that employee's option, they can say, I want this. Time is more valuable than money. To me, with my life, what I've got going on, the balance of my family life, that is more important. But again, remember, this may not be something that all employers want to exercise. This amendment removes the regulation that prevents the private sector from doing something that the public sector has already done since 1985. This just removes that regulation, and then if an employer wants to offer this as a benefit to their employees, and then only at the option, the voluntary option of the employee, is it exercised.
So I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but is Mr. Courtney's example of his having done this, was this a violation of this rule when he said he allowed his employees?
The difference is paid time and unpaid time. When Mr. Courtney had the emergency in his business and the parent, and, send them, go, it's an emergency, go. There's a difference between the ability to accrue paid time off, which is what compensatory time is, meaning the 40-hour work week stays in place. Any time worked beyond the 40-hour work week, the employee would have the option to get paid time and a half or time and a half paid time off. For every hour of overtime accrued, they could exercise the option to have an hour and a half paid time off, which is the difference, I believe, with the example that Mr. Courtney gave. Currently, under current law with the private sector, there is flexibility within the pay period, meaning if it's a 2-week pay period, the individual could work more than the 40-hour work week, but it would have to be used within that pay period. There's nothing under current law that allows within the private sector an individual to bank overtime to be used. In our committee, as you will remember, we had a hearing, and Karen DeLoach, who does payroll for an accounting firm in Montgomery, Alabama, where I live, came and testified that she has friends that work in the State House that have been doing this for a long time. And she went to her employer and said, why can't I do this? And he said, well, it's against the law. You can't bank overtime hours to be used at a later date as paid time off. People want to plan. In Karen's situation, she wanted to plan for a missions trip that she took to Nicaragua for her church every summer. And so that would be a distinct difference between those examples.
It's a fairness issue, correct?
It is, and it's commonsensical in my opinion.
We hear a lot about fairness from the other side. I'm glad that it's boiled down to a very simple issue of fairness. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me first start with the administration statement. The policy, the administration strongly opposes H.R. 1406, the legislation undermines the existing right to hard-earned overtime pay on which many working families rely to make ends meet, while misrepresenting itself as a workplace flexibility measure that gives power to employees over their own schedule. If the President were presented with this legislation, his senior advisors would recommend that he veto the bill. Ms. Roby, I'm sure that you are sincerely interested in the American family and the American workers, but talking about what families are trying to do now to make ends meet, it does take two people to work in a family. We all know that. I mean, when my children were small, my husband's income was plenty enough for us to live on and just educate our children in college, no more. I have three daughters who are in entirely different positions, and they're more common than not. And this bill has been around a long time, and it's never even come close to being law. And I must be honest to tell you, I am genuinely conflicted on this committee. At least once a week, and it seems like this whole term, we bring up bills that we know are never going to become law. I don't know what it is we think we're doing here. Filling time is obviously what we're doing here. But the Senate's not going to take up this bill, and it doesn't change the traditional 40-hour work week in any way. What you're saying is absolutely removes the fundamental requirement that we've had since 1938, that employees who had a 40-hour work week and that they would be paid overtime. The idea was to give them more time with their families. But I'm really concerned about the fact, I know the committee will support this because it's got to be on the floor tomorrow, or we don't have anything else to do here. So we'll play the game, but I must say that I wish you weren't doing this one. This has been around too long. This one has whiskers, and it doesn't make any sense. Working people have not had a raise in this country. Almost most of them are working the same rate. No rise in minimum wage. People are struggling. And if you had one job, maybe two, as a lot of people do, particularly single parents, and your employer required that you work overtime instead of compensation, and you had to give up the other job, I don't think you considered that possibility. And in a country where people are working two and maybe three jobs just to put food on the table, I think we would be really neglectful if we did not think about those people as well. So I'm sorry I can't support the bill today, but thank you for your work.
Thank you. You caught me by surprise here. I first would just like to say to my friend Ms. Fox that I'm reading about our government's land policies, and you talk about fairness? Good grief. What a dream world you find yourself in. Ms. Roby, could I just ask two concepts that were found in this statement of administrative policy, because I think you addressed them, but I may have missed something along the way. The third line in here says this gives power to the employees over the flexibility measure gives power to employees over their own schedules. Now, is that correct?
That it gives power to the employee for their schedule?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And this says that this is a misrepresentation of that concept. Is the administration understanding the bill when they put this out?
No, sir. And in fact, the whole idea that it undermines the ability to accrue overtime is false. It doesn't undermine the ability to accrue overtime. The 40-hour work week is intact. The accrual of overtime for cash wages remains the same. All this does is remove the regulation that prevents the private employer from offering compensatory in time if the employee chooses.
You convinced me. I was just wondering if I missed something
No,
what
sir.
the administration was saying about the bill in reality. It also says H.R. 1406 would not prevent employers from cutting the overtime hours. Is that correct?
That it would
Would not prevent employers from cutting overtime hours.
Yeah, the employer must comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act as is currently written.
So this doesn't change the overtime policy.
No, sir.
What about the policy of an employer, taking a full-time employer and cutting them down to part-time so they don't have to pay their insurance costs?
That would fall under...
Totally under different area.
Correct.
So one of the real problems that we actually face in the workforce isn't even covered in this one, is it?
That the employer would reduce a full-time employee to a part-time?
Part-time employees to save on areas like insurance costs.
They can't do that under this
Medical
bill.
costs because they can't afford it otherwise.
Well, that's a whole nother ball of wax.
Whole different bill, yeah.
Right.
So it's not covered in yours at all.
No, sir.
But it is one of the problems we face. And someday, I'm sure the Senate, who knows how to take things up in a proper manner, will tell us how to solve that problem.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
There was something I wanted to get clearer in my mind. The remedy for the employee is to go to court in federal court?
There's several remedies. The employee can go to federal court, or they can go to the Department of Labor, at which the Department of Labor will try to remedy the situation. But the Department of Labor could also sue the employer if they believe that this is happening.
So a low-wage person, mostly, as pointed out in this article from Time Magazine, saying that this meant ripping off workers. Someone trying to just manage to stay above water and loses the overtime, which they've counted on, would be required to go to federal court.
Now, they would not be required to go to federal court. They could go to federal court if they chose to use that option. They could also pick up the phone and call the Department of Labor, which is the same remedy that they currently have under the Fair Labor Standards Act, if there was any problems with overtime pay under Section 7.
Boy, that is pretty thin, but thank you.
Well, let me thank you both for being here, and let me just say, I had hoped that after a week of recess, where we all went back and met with our constituents, that we would come back and actually be doing something very different, like fixing sequestration or going to conference on a budget. But instead, we're doing this, and I want to associate myself with my colleague from New York. I mean, look, the administration is pretty clear on where they're coming down on this. I don't see any reason to believe that the Senate's going to take this up. I look at this bill. I see it's a bill that benefits bosses at the expense of their workers, and we can spin that any way we want to. But I will also point out that a wide variety of women's and labor and other organizations all oppose this bill. The workers. It's not just the administration. There are groups that represent workers, a lot of them low-income workers in particular, who oppose this bill. But I just want to say, when I was home, again, nobody mentioned this as a compelling issue to me. People do talk about the fact that wages are stagnant. You get people that are working and making the minimum wage or just above it and still living in poverty. If I were to report back to you what my constituents are saying to you, they want an increase in their pay so they can actually support their families and get through this difficult economic time. They're looking for more jobs. But I thought, because I've heard this from my constituents as well, is that this sequestration is having a negative impact on a lot of different jobs and a lot of different sectors. Now, before we left, we fixed, or we provided some sort of a fix so that powerful people, including members of Congress, would not have their flights delayed when we decided to go on recess. But at the same time, we had food banks being closed all around the country because of sequestration. We have people losing their jobs because of sequestration. We have people being furloughed because of sequestration. And yet, we're not doing anything about sequestration at this moment. And again, going back to the budget, I've sat through this committee, and I've heard my colleagues on the other side rail against the Senate for not passing a budget. We had to pass this theatrical bill that said that somehow we would not get paid if they didn't pass the budget. They passed the budget. They passed the budget. You may not like the budget, they passed it. And we passed the budget I hate. But nonetheless, there's two budgets. What you're supposed to do now is go to conference and try to work out a deal. I would like to think with all the hoopla that led up to getting the Senate to pass a budget that we would be talking about going to conference now and trying to figure out a way to fix this economy. But we're doing this, which again, I have a great deal of respect for Mrs. Roby and for all the work that is done on the committee, but when all is said and done, we're not doing anything to help anybody here. And that's what we're supposed to be here for. And so I would just respectfully say, and this is not aimed at you,
but at the leadership of this House, you got to start bringing things to the floor that are going to help people that we know that we can actually work together on and get passed through both bodies and get it to the White House so we can sign, they can be signed, we can actually do some stuff. And unfortunately,
The gentleman yield.
I'm happy to yield to the gentlelady from North Carolina.
Well, don't you think it's fair to allow people who work in the private sector to have the same options that union employees and people who work in the public sector have? Why is that not important to the many people who work in the private sector?
I'm happy to have a discussion with the gentlelady about labor rights and labor reform in this country and about giving workers a fair shake, because they don't get one right now. But this is not the bill to do it. And I would just say to the gentlelady, there's got to be a reason. I know the gentlelady thinks that her side has a monopoly on all good ideas, but there's got to be a reason why virtually every major workers' organization, women's organization, thinks this is a bad idea. But I would just again say to the gentlelady, as I said before, this is an exercise that we know is not going anywhere. And I am just a little bit frustrated after spending a week at home listening to my constituents talk about the fact that sequestration is having an awful impact on their economy, providing uncertainty. And I'm also a little frustrated after the big hoopla that the gentlelady and others made about the Senate not passing a budget. They passed a budget. Why aren't we going to conference? Why aren't we trying to do something in working truly in a bipartisan way to try to actually help improve the quality of life for people? And we're not doing it. That's all I'm saying to the gentlelady. We can argue until the cows come home about this bill, but you know as well as I do, with the statement of the administration statement and the fact that we have no reason to believe the Senate's going to act on it, this is going nowhere. So she could have a press release, and that's all fine and nice.
But we don't have a unicameral system of government. It's the House's responsibility to put out their good ideas and wait for and hope the Senate will take them.
Will the gentlelady initiate an effort to try to move her leadership to go to conference with the Senate on the budget, since we need to show the leadership that, can we go to conference on the budget? Why is that?
I have great confidence in Mr. Ryan, who's chairman of the Budget Committee. I think he does a wonderful job, and I suspect that he's doing all that he can do to see that we go to conference on the budget.
All you need to do is say we're going to go to conference and appoint conferees, and we can begin the process. That doesn't take a lot of work to do that. And I would just again say to the gentlelady, I know that we fixed the problem in the sequestration that impacts a lot of powerful people, but there are a whole lot of other problems in that bill that we haven't fixed.
Will the gentleman yield again?
Yield to the gentlelady.
I did some flying during the holidays, and I didn't fly with powerful people. I flew with average Americans. And you know what? Changing the way the FAA was implementing the sequestration didn't just help members of Congress, it helped everybody who flew. And in fact, I was really struck by the diverse people who I saw on airplanes this weekend.
I'm sure
I flew in coach
I'm sure you saw a lot of
class.
minimum wage workers on airplanes.
I flew in coach class, and I think that benefited everybody. The motivation behind trying to fix the president's sequestration is not to benefit members of Congress, but is to benefit the American public.
I thank the gentlelady. I just find it curious that we fixed that the day before we were about to fly out of town. And I also find it a little bit troubling, quite frankly, that we fixed that, and at the same time we're allowing the cuts go into effect that are actually closing food banks down around the country. I think there's a little disconnect there. And so, a lot of the people we're talking to who we worry about with this legislation, they're not the people that fly all around the country. They're people who are, barely making minimum wage or a little bit above that. Those are the people who often get forgotten in this House. So all I'm simply saying is that, with all due respect to the gentlelady, we're going to go through this. I hope we get an open rule, but they don't like open rules in the majority here anymore, so we don't get very many of them. But we'll make an attempt at doing that. But I just think our time would be better spent at this particular point trying to come to some accommodation with the Senate and the White House and actually fix some of the problems that, quite frankly, are wreaking havoc on our economy. So I think that...
Would the gentleman yield one more time?
I'm happy to yield,
Okay.
gentlelady.
My question I asked at the beginning, would you like to eliminate the advantage that union employees and public employees have over the private sector? Our colleague from New York is worried that these are going to be lawsuits, but that's exactly what public sector's
The way I look at this
employees
bill,
have to do.
the way I look at this bill, it's a backdoor way to weaken the 40-hour work week, and that's my view. But again, I think it fits in with the other legislation that we have dealt with with regard to workers in this committee. So I'm not surprised about that. All I'm simply saying is that given where we are, it would seem to me we ought to get this budget resolved and we ought to fix sequestration. Those are the most compelling things. And I thank the chairman for his generosity with time.
I thank you very much. Just as a point of reference, I viewed that what was done last week with the sequestration of the FAA was a person who paid a ticket price included a fee that would go directly to the government to provide the service. And it's a safety issue, and it's an important issue that's energy and commerce. And I viewed that the person was paying that regardless whether they were minimum wage or someone else. And so that's...
Mr. Chairman, just you one more for 1 second.
Gentleman brought the issue up. He should speak on it.
I would just simply say that we ought to fix everything. And in the scheme of things, being delayed on an airplane compared to having a food bank eliminated because of sequestration cuts, I don't think that airline delay would make the top of my list. We ought to fix everything.
Well,
thank you.
And I do appreciate the gentleman. I'm also well aware that there's plenty of room for discussion on this issue, and I hope we will, in fact, get to that. Mr. Cole, Chairman Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the Rules Committee. And I'm surprised my friends point the FFA legislation is somehow a mistake since they overwhelmingly voted for it. As I recall, it passed this House with only 41 votes in opposition. I'm not saying how you vote. I'm just saying the majority of both parties overwhelmingly supported that legislation. The President signed it almost immediately. And I would actually say that's perhaps a good reason why we ought to consider bills that the President said he won't consider, because sometimes he changes his mind. And in this case, I want to give both of you a chance to address the question that my good friend from North Carolina raised, because I think it's a salient one. Explain to me why we have this in the public sector, and it's a good thing, and it would be bad to do essentially, as I understand it, exactly the same thing in the private sector. I mean, it's either all good or all bad. Why would we trust the government but not trust private employers and employees to act in their best interest? So I've just posed that to both of you and would love to hear the response.
So historically, if you look at comp time in the public sector, it actually really started to evolve in the 1990s. And because I, actually was curious about the same question and did some digging, and and actually the National Federation of Independent Businesses back in the 1990s supported it. And the reason is to give basically state governments and local governments the ability to not spend money for their budgets and to come up with a different way of compensation. And they are regulated totally differently than the private sector. Again, as Martha said, if you've got a complaint today in the private sector, you go to your state labor department. That's not how the public sector works. Civil service commissions, many of them have collective bargaining agreements that have grievance systems that are set up. Only 8% of the private sector is organized right now. So really, the Department of Labor is really your forum if you have a dispute. I mean, federal court's a nice thought, but as Louise said, I mean, that's just out of reach for the $14 an hour, even $17 an hour worker that's there. Again, they will be swamped. There's just no way. And again, I dealt with the Wage and Hours Division in Connecticut. The nice thing about the law right now with the Fair Labor Standards Act is an investigation by the Wage and Hours Division. It's cut and dried. You basically look at the payroll records. Did you work 40 hours? If you worked an hour over, you got to pay a time and a half. Now you're setting up a system where you're basically going to have almost a discovery process in terms of the agreement, whether or not the use of time under Section 7 of the bill, which I again think is very clear that the employer does have veto power over whether or not you can use the comp time. I mean, it is just going to create a total layer of work that I don't think any of our states are ready for if this seriously came into law. And in the public sector, all I can say is there are critics within the labor side of the equation who frankly aren't that happy with the comp system in the public sector because it hasn't been that great in terms of enforcing it.
Are any public employee unions that you're aware of anxious to give this up?
Well, I would say that, they don't give it universal high marks because...
Yeah, but I mean, do they want to give it up if it's a terrible thing?
I don't think they frankly see that as a realistic option because I think state governments would push back because they, as I said, it's a budget balancer for a lot of public sector entities.
Well, the answer is, depending on how you framed your question, the answer is no. No, it shouldn't be any different in the private sector than it is in the public sector. And I, too, had to go back in history and kind of look at this because it has been before the House on so many occasions. But I did want to just read this because I think it's very important. The Senate Labor Committee explained regarding the inclusion of compensatory time for state and local governments in the 1985 amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is what the committee said. The committee also is cognizant that many state and local government employers and their employees voluntarily have worked out arrangements providing for compensatory time off in lieu of pay for hours worked beyond the normally scheduled work week. These arrangements, frequently the result of collective bargaining, reflect mutually satisfactory solutions that are both fiscally and socially responsible. To the extent practicable, we wish to accommodate such arrangements. And so I know the talking point is that to save them money, but this came out of the Senate Labor Committee in that they wanted to accommodate it because it was mutually agreed upon. And the argument that the Department of Labor doesn't have the ability to enforce, this is what they're doing now. And as we heard testimony in the committee from an employer that has both public and private employees working within the same workplace where the public employees already enjoy this, that they have seen no evidence at all that this is bad in the public sector. And quite frankly, it works very well. So I maintain the position, to answer your question, that clearly if government is going to say it's good enough for government, then it ought to be good enough for the private sector as well.
I agree. I think you either trust people or you don't. You either trust employers or you don't. I think most of the time employers and employees know what's best for them. I think most of the time they work pretty well together. It seems to me that you wouldn't have one system for private employees and a different one for public employees. So, just seems pretty practical and pretty fair. Yield back.
Thank you very much, Chairman Cole. Mr. Polis?
Yeah, first for Ms. Roby. It seems to me there's I think you mentioned that this was a win-win, but what I'm worried about here is that there's actually value that's conveyed towards the employer away from the employee. One of the things that seems to be missing, for instance, is any calculation of interest on the amounts that are due. I'm wondering why that was omitted. I mean, again, let's say that it's whatever hours were worked and it was so much money and they set it aside for a year into the account and here they are 12 months later, and it turns out the employee didn't need the comp time, wanted to keep that flexibility, but didn't use it. Now they get paid, but there was no interest. Now that isn't as big a deal when interest rates are 2-3%, but if it was 10-15%, it would be a really big deal. Why isn't interest incorporated in there?
The idea of a low-interest loan, which is what has been an argument or no-interest loan is what has been an argument for a long time, is wrong because it is at the option of the employee to exercise this to begin with. No one is forcing to the employee as to whether or not they want to accrue overtime to begin with. And so if the employee exercises that option, they do so knowing that when they cash out, it could be at a later date. This is a benefit for working moms and dads who value time, and the benefit is their choice. And so if they choose to forego cash payments, that individual, not mandated by the employer, but completely voluntarily, then they do so knowing that they would receive those cash payments at a later date should they choose to cash out. So it's their choice.
Well, the cash payments at a later date would be worth less because of the net present value of the money at that time. It seems like it would be a relatively easy fix to just simply account for that and just say it's the inflation rate or something like that, so the employee isn't forced to basically buy their flexibility. I mean, they're basically paying money out of pocket by setting part of their salary aside. They're out the interest rate. I mean, why should that all come from the employee's back?
But they're not forced. And see, we keep using these words like forced and required and mandated. Nothing in this bill forces anybody to do anything.
I didn't say forced or mandated. Again, what you were saying is we're going to charge you, 2% of your money if you want to have some flexible time, over the next 6 or 12 months. And you're right, some employees will take it, some won't. But why even charge them? Why not? Why are you charging employees to give them flexibility? I mean, it seems like an easy fix just to say we're going to account for inflation, and you want it back at the end of the year, you get it. But I don't know why the employee, if they want that flexibility, should have to actually pay for that with part of their income.
Remember, the employee, should they choose to opt for this time voluntarily, they can use it at any time, whether it's the next week or within that 12-month period before they have to cash out.
Well, and this becomes a bigger deal, obviously, if they wait 10 or 11 months. If they wait a week or two, it's negligible. I would also ask, what happens if in the intervening time, they say they set it aside for up to a year, what happens if the company goes out of business or is unable to make payroll during that period of that time?
That's a great question, and that is all provided for in this bill. The accrued time is given the same legal treatment under a bankruptcy proceeding as would earned wages.
Which,
so
of course,
it's a
right, which is a very senior treatment, of course, but nevertheless could be settled for some fraction on the dollar versus had they been paid at the time. So, I mean, if they had been paid at the time while the company was in business and paid overtime, they would have gotten it. If they defer it and 6 months later the company goes out of business and owes them 2 or 3 weeks of overtime, they might very well get 90 cents or 80 cents on the dollar or some other amount. But nevertheless, the fact that it's given senior treatment doesn't necessarily ensure that they would fully be paid.
And neither do overtime payments. It's given the exact same treatment as earned wages.
Yes, and that's much more immediate, as we talked about. That's in a two-week or 1 month payroll period. Here we're talking about periods of 6 months. I mean, just realistically on the ground, many companies do go out of business every year. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I mean, a reasonable number go out of business every year. So this is a situation that people will face. I'm sure the senior treatment is some consolation, and of course, traditionally, payroll has come ahead of other obligations as it should. But nevertheless, the employees might be penalized just as they are on the interest side for their decision to defer some of their pay. I want to move to Mr. Courtney real quickly. It seems like there's some kernel of a good idea here, I would hope, to give employees control and flexibility, not charge them for it. Do you see some way where this concept could be written and accomplished in a way that was perhaps more friendly to the worker and truly gave them the discretion to decide on that trade-off?
Sure. As I said, in my opening remarks, I mean, one of the great step forwards in this country was passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act back in the 1990s. In that case, there is built-in guaranteed protection where the employee has the right to exercise at the time of a birth of a child or an adoption, that they have that time off. But obviously, the question that we have to sort of wrestle with here is just that when people sacrifice their income to elect that choice, I mean, their ability to really have real flexibility is really somewhat limited. And
I think what you're referring to here is you would take away kind of the veto right of the company in terms of the person being able to take the time when they need it, or at least provide clear criteria that they can kind of take it with if they're, ill or have for maternity or something like that. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, I have the highest respect for Martha. Again, I think that unreasonably disruptive, protection that the bill calls for in terms of the use of time it's a very thin reed for the employee in terms of trying to exercise their built-up comp time if this were ever to become law. I mean, the fact is that it is still in the employer's discretion about whether or not that comp time can get exercised. And that just really doesn't do the trick in terms of giving people.
What other key attributes would you want to see in, a bill to kind of accomplish giving employees more flexibility to do this kind of thing?
Well, again, I think that, paid sick time is something that is true flexibility for people, that if they have a sick child at home when they wake up in the morning, they can't run down and sign and execute a written agreement with their employer. They've got to make, decisions right there on the spot. And having a built-in paid sick time provision in the amendment that Congresswoman DeLauro wants to present is only 7 days. I mean, that's far lower than any European Union nation presently provides for. That really gives people true flexibility in terms of responding to family crises and emergencies. Having this, sort of leisurely process of crafting a written agreement is just not a workable structure for the 92% of private sector workforces that are not unionized.
So the DeLauro Amendment, Amendment 1, it sounds like what you're a co-sponsor of would vastly improve the bill. Hopefully we can advance this to the floor under an open process. I think it's a good candidate for, Mr. Chairman, an open rule in that it's a very tangible bill around a certain area. I don't think it would delay the work of the House. I think we certainly have time this week for an open rule. There's only been 7 amendments submitted. I don't think there would be too many more that would even be offered on the floor under an open rule. And we can certainly work to make sure that the work of the House could still be done in an expedient manner under an open rule, which is what I hope we'll consider this bill under. And I yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman from Colorado. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll tell you, Ms. Roby, I was bragging about you while I was home over the past week, because folks always ask about how the process works in Washington and whether or not folks who are new to the process, as you and I are, we came in the same freshman class, have an opportunity to make a difference. And I say, you know what? About 40% of that U.S. House of Representatives has served for 3 years or less. And we've, in fact, got a bill coming up next week that is going to make a huge difference for folks. And it is, in fact, being carried by a freshman. So I just want you to know how proud I am of what you are succeeding in doing with this bill. I did hear a lot from folks last week about jobs and job opportunities. Now, I have to say I agree with the line that Mr. Bishop was going down. I talked to employer after employer who was laying off full-time workers and hiring part-time workers because of the President's health care bill. And I think that the gentleman from Massachusetts is absolutely right. There are going to be a lot of folks working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and it's going to be more difficult for them to balance that. But I want to get to Mr. Courtney's concerns, because I was touched by Mr. McGovern's plea to do those things that we can do in a bipartisan way. And candidly, before walking into this hearing today, I thought this was one of those things. I looked at how hard you've worked on this bill, Ms. Roby, and the groups you've reached out to try to make it a possibility. I thought this would be one. Mr. Courtney, let me ask you, before I go back to the author to get some answers, thinking about your concern that you can't just put together one of these agreements on the fly when your child gets sick the next day. It's absolutely true. Do you have any options today if your child gets sick the next day that would be taken away from you under this bill?
I'm sorry, can you
rephrase
the end of that question?
I thought you were absolutely right that if what I need, I've got Mother's Day coming up a week from today, if I want some time to go be with my mother on Mother's Day, maybe I can't draft one of these last-minute agreements with my employer in order to make that possible. Am I disadvantaged by this bill in that respect? Are there opportunities I would have today in the private sector to be with my mom on Mother's Day that are going to be taken away from me with Ms. Roby's legislation?
Well, I guess you could certainly say there's no minus, that it creates. I mean, on the other hand, if we're selling this bill as family flexibility, though, I think it has some duty to live up to its billing. And in real life, I mean, that really is, for single parents waking up with a kid who's, got a 100-plus degree temperature, or, again, this really just doesn't give that flexibility.
No question there are things that you would like for the bill to do that it doesn't, but I was working on that idea of whether or not there are any minuses here. Because on the plus side, I'm thinking, yes, because current law within this pay period, if I want to be with my mom on Mother's Day, I'm in this 2-week pay period, I'm working overtime, I could go ahead and swap out some of that overtime I'm working so I could take Sunday off and be with my mom. Is that an accurate reflection of current law?
It's accurate to the extent that the employer makes its own unilateral determination that it's not, quote-unquote, unduly disruptive. And again, that's where I think that ability to exercise it, even in the case where you've got some, horizon that you could plan for it, still is quite shaky.
So when we talk about the discretion that Ms. Roby's bill gives to employers to make these decisions, you're saying it's the exact same discretion that they have today within the 2-week pay period? I mean, I can't force my employer to let me off on Mother's Day during the current 2-week pay period, can I? I mean, you're saying that's completely at their discretion today, and it would continue to be at their discretion tomorrow under the same rules we have today.
Yeah, but remember, you're paying a price for that so-called flexibility, which is that you're sacrificing your statutory overtime cash benefit.
Which I'm doing today as well within a pay period. I have the right to do that today. I have the right today to spend Mother's Day with my family and have comp time to do it, but I don't have the right to spend Father's Day with my family because that's outside of this pay period, and the law won't let me carry time from pay period to pay period. Am I understanding the current state of the law?
Again, as I said in my opening remarks, employers today have the ability to give people that time off for family events or circumstances, which, again, is just totally, and that happens in real life, all the time. When, you knock on the door and, hey, it's my mother's birthday, can I have Thursday off? And employers say, sure. So that there's, what this bill, again, is doing is it's setting up a system where people have to sacrifice their statutory cash benefits to overtime in order to get a comp period that may or may not be available to them, depending on the employer's whim.
I had read some similar things in the news, Mr. Courtney, and I want you to explore that with me because I thought that same thing. I thought that perhaps the bill had been written so that instead of getting paid time and a half, I was going to have to sacrifice that time and a half, and I was going to get 1 hour of comp time. But as I went through and read the bill, it tells me that I can either get the hour and a half of paid overtime or the hour and a half of comp time. And if I decide I would rather have the cash than the comp time, I can cash out that comp time at any time. So when you say I'm giving up my opportunity to have the time and a half cash overtime, help me understand what I'm giving up.
Sure. I mean, so if a small business has got kind of an order for work that's going to require 40+ hours, you got 2 employees and say, hey, I need somebody to work late, and can one of you can do it by comp and one of you can do it by cash. And the guy says, well, I'll do it with comp time so I don't have to lay out the cash. Then the employer, there is a built-in incentive that is naturally going to flow to the person who's saying, hey, I'm willing to waive my cash payment.
So if we had that heavy workflow going on in our company this week, I could be the guy who said, I'd like to work for comp time, and then I could use that comp time to be with my family on Father's Day in June.
Yeah, but the problem is if you're the guy who really needs the cash, right, and you've got your coworker who says, I'll do it with comp time, the employer, really gets to pick and choose, whose rights get exercised here. And that's really where I think there is this, sort of
you're saying that's what happens? That's what happens in today's marketplace?
No, I'm saying that would happen if this bill became law.
So today, if I wanted time off for Mother's Day and we had an extra run going at the factory, my employer's not allowed to say who's willing to work for overtime and who's willing to work for comp time in this pay period? You're saying
that's right, because the law says you pay cash under the Fair Labor Standards Act.
Well, I thought the Fair Labor Standards Act allowed me to have comp time within my 2-week pay period currently. That I'm allowed to if I work 50 hours in this pay period and there's still work to go, I can take those 10 hours off at the tail end of the pay period in comp time. Am I misunderstanding the?
There really is no comp time trade-off under existing Fair Labor Standards Act. Martha said people can get unpaid time off at the, there's complete flexibility for employers to do that for time less than 40 hours. But if you need people to work longer than 40 hours, you got to pay cash.
Let me ask you this. You've made a compelling case for some of the challenges that employees face, and I've talked to those families just like you have. Mr. McGovern made a passionate case for why can't we work on things to do together. And Mr. Polis made some good points about why he wished this bill would do even more than it does. Why isn't this one of those things? If the minus isn't there, it's taking something away from my family that's trying to sort these issues out. Why can't we take, whether it's a baby step forward or a giant step forward, why isn't this one of those things we can come together on? And
Go ahead.
Please.
Yeah, look, I would say that there was no minus in the specific sort of narrow contours of the question that you asked. I mean, broadly speaking, I do think this is a step backwards for all the reasons that it blurs the lines about what people's rights are in terms of overtime. Again, we have a bright line system that has been on the books since the 1930s, easy to enforce. No lawyers, no federal court cases, no discovery to figure out what an agreement was and whether it was valid and whether or not unduly disruptive was exercised properly or not. This really creates, I think, just great uncertainty in the workforce, and the person who I think is going to take it in the back of the neck in more cases than not is the worker.
I think you have accurately weighed those challenges, and candidly, I don't know what, I think I have a good sense of where my constituency is, but I've put that question out to them. On the one hand, you have this agreement that you can opt into. The employer can't force you into it. It would give you some flexibility, but choices have consequences. You'd be involved in these choices. Or two, we can keep this bright line standard under which everyone knows what their rights and responsibilities are, but within that bright line standard come some strictures that prevent you from making some choices that you might like to make. And I'll be interested to see whether folks prefer the certainty that you've accurately described or prefer the flexibility. Certainly in tough economic times like we're having today, again, lots of things working against workers today, whether folks are going to prefer the certainty or prefer the flexibility. Let me ask you, Ms. Roby, candidly, again, I was going through the language back in the days when the gentleman from my great state of Georgia was president, Jimmy Carter. We were experiencing 12% inflation a year. We were actually having inflation as high in a single month then as we're having now, and I understand the gentleman's question. But the language I saw, and I may have misread it, it says that if I've been accumulating this comp time, an hour and a half of paid overtime that I'm putting in my comp time bank, if I've been working hard, applying myself, these step increases that are in law, that when I cash out, my employer has to pay me the higher of whatever my wage was when I earned the comp time or whatever wage I'm earning today. The gentleman's talking about 1% inflation a year that one might lose. Is this bill crafted to say that if I cash out at the end of the year, I get cashed out at the pay rate I have earned by the end of the year, not the lower pay rate I was earning at the beginning of the year?
That's correct, and that's very plain language in the bill, black and white, that if and when the employee cashes out, that they are paid at the higher of the two wages, whether what they earned or versus what they earned in the time that they cash out, whichever's higher.
Well, I have told my constituents back home, I don't think I'm going to be able to do the really big things here that I'd like to do. I'd like to see the fair tax pass tomorrow. I'd like to see the President's health care bill repealed tomorrow. I don't think we're going to get those big ticket items, but that we can work together to take one little step forward day after day. And guess what? We would wake up 365 days from now and figure out we had really done a lot for working families back home. I know a lot of folks are trying to talk you out of the direction that you're going for reasons that I simply cannot understand. If we can make one choice better for one family, I don't know why this isn't a step worth taking. I see lots and lots of pluses, some that even seem to be unjust pluses. I can't believe an employer is going to be excited about paying that extra money. And at the end of the day, you're saying I'm not forcing the employer to do it. It's the employer's choice and the employee's choice. Now, I want to ask one final thing, because thinking about businesses going out of business, you generally sense that when you're at a place and it's falling on hard times. I know here, if I want to change my health plan, I'm only allowed to change once a year. So I get the sense that my employer is getting ready to go under. I'm not going to be able to get my comp time back. I'm going to have to wait a year to get that comp time, to make the request to get paid for all of my comp time.
Well, when you're talking about under a bankruptcy proceeding or prior to?
Under current law, I just wake up one day and I say, you know what, I've opted into this thing, but I think I've made a terrible mistake.
The employer has to give you your accrued comp time in overtime wages at the higher of the two within 30 days.
Not a year from now?
No. But there is a cash-out provision at the end of the 12 months, whether it's December 31 or another 12-month period that you've decided on in the agreement. If at the end of that 12-month period there's unused compensatory time, accrued compensatory time, the employer must pay you the overtime wages within 30 days of that end of the 12-month period date.
So, again, from my perspective, it looks like I'm getting a great deal as an employee. If, as my colleague suggested, it turns out I think I got a rotten deal as an employee, I get all the money I saved up at time and a half rates, and I get it back in a paycheck within 30 days.
That's correct.
Wow.
And can I just go back to one other thing? Mr. Courtney said that you can't go sign an agreement, and he's absolutely correct. If there were a family emergency or anything, but I would just like to use the word plan, because that's what working moms and dads do. I can tell you from my perspective, on Sunday nights before I fly back up to D.C., my husband and I have our weekly powwow where we figure out what city we're going to be in and who's taking what child where and how we're going to get all that. We have to plan, and working families do plan. And that's the whole point of this bill, is to allow employees to plan and then use that accrued time at a time that works for them. And then if they have banked accrued hours, then when those family emergencies come up and they may not have any more sick they may not have any more sick leave, they may not have any more vacation leave. This allows for them to afford themselves just a little bit of a cushion, because as you know, particularly with small children or aging parents or dealing with a sick relative, you can't plan for everything. And so this would provide that opportunity. And then real quickly, if I may, because Mr. Courtney referred to some of these things, so I just want to circle back, but under the, he talked about the Family Medical Leave Act being such a great piece of legislation we've come so far in the passage of this. The unduly disrupt that he is describing as lien in this bill is the same standard used under the Family Medical Leave Act. And the employer has to run a business. And so if the employee requesting time off at a time that the employer would not be able to run the business in their absence, clearly we're not trying to shift this so it is unfairly rated in either direction. This is a fair trade-off here. And then we've heard the word paying the price or sacrificing their overtime pay. I just want to remind this committee again, this is wholly optional. It is only dependent upon the employee. And if the employee wants to, using Mr. Courtney's terminology, sacrifice overtime pay for time off, well, that's the beauty of this. If they value time more than cash payments, it is up to them to make that decision and opt for that. And so, and lastly, of what he was talking about, the employer walking in a room of employees and saying, we've got this big order to fill and I can offer comp time, but I want to offer overtime, but only to the employees that are willing to accept comp time. That is absolutely not within the realm of this law. The employer, under no circumstances, can discriminate, offer this as a means of to choose to save themselves money. And I would refer you back to Section 4, where it clearly lays out that the employer shall not directly or indirectly intimidate, threaten, or coerce, or attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any employee for the purpose of A, interfering with such employee's rights under this subsection to request or to not request compensatory time off in lieu of payment of monetary overtime compensation for overtime hours, or requiring any employee to use compensatory time. If they have overtime hours to offer, it is per the agreement between that employer that had been executed before the time had ever been accrued. And so I just wanted to make that point.
It is so tempting here to try to be all things to all people in a piece of legislation, which is why we end up with 3,000-page bills. I'm glad you mentioned Section 4 because anybody can go to thomas.house.gov and read your bill. It's golly, it's only 9 pages. In fact, there's probably more lines of people co-sponsoring your legislation because they're so excited about it than there are lines of text. And I know this is not going to be all things to all people, but it is one step in the direction of giving workers some choice, and one step to respond to those folks back home who say, Rob, why is it that you let the federal government do things that you won't let us do in the private sector? Why won't you live under the rules that you pass for everybody else? It's a step in that direction. I applaud you for pushing forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nugent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to a fellow freshman, thank you for bringing this piece of legislation forward. And to the ranking member, appreciate your comments. Having worked in an agency that started off with comp time before 1985, that gave you hour for hour, which was a ripoff. Just plain simple, you come in and work midnight to 1, and instead of getting time and a half, you got an hour for hour. Then 1985 came along, and the law changed. The law came in and said that they could give you comp time or in lieu of overtime, that hour and a half for the hour and a half pay. Then we went to comp time where it was strictly the employee's choice. And before we ever were unionized, we had employee choice in regards to comp time. And they decided, and I was one of those at that point, not in management, decided that I like comp time at some point in time to utilize instead of overtime. You know, when you want to be with your family or you have a birth coming up and you have X amount of, we had sick time or other leave time, and you wanted to add that to it, you banked your comp time so you could have that time off. Then, you know, Family Medical Leave Act came along. And I had employees that, you know, had X amount of sick time that they could take off so they're compensated during that FMLA. But they also saved up their comp time because that kept the bills being paid during a time where they could stay home, and particularly if it was a husband staying home with their wife after having a child, or for whatever reason taking care of someone that qualified under FMLA, that they could continue paying their bills. But they made choices. I made a choice when I took comp time versus overtime because I wanted to have some quality time. Now, employers always have the right to dictate when you take leave time. They always have. Otherwise, you could have everybody say, hey, listen, I want every Friday off, and who's going to be here to answer the phone? So it's obvious that that's not an undue hardship. Employees typically work that out, but from an employer, I hated to have comp time on the books. As an employer, I'd rather just pay you overtime and get that off the books so I didn't have to worry about, you know, meeting the needs of comp time. But for an employee, when we talked about reducing the number of hours employees could bank, oh my gosh, you would think you'd have a revolt because they love the opportunity to have the choice to do either or. If they got a lot of overtime in a week, they could bank half of it, or they could take pay. That gives you so much flexibility as somebody that's raising a family than I can imagine when you just say, oh, we're just going to pay it. Because sometimes pay isn't everything in regards to, they want to have the time off too, because they value the time with their families, whether it's for baseball or for football or for whatever. So I think this is a great opportunity to move so the private sector has the same opportunities. They do it if you're unionized. Unions bargain for this all the time and hammer employers to death all the time to get the ability to have comp time as a bank for their employees, because the employees want it. Well, for the employees that don't have a union, and you mentioned, you know, the number of employees that are in the private sector that are non-unionized, this is a real plus. This is like having a union bargain this for. This is a benefit that they don't have to take, though. It's not forced upon them. Am I correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. It's completely, but where a union is present, it has to be part of the collective bargaining agreement. But yes, this is completely voluntary. If the employer chooses to offer comp time, it is only up to the option of the employee as to whether or not to take it in lieu of cash wages.
After we became unionized, the union actually wanted to increase the number of hours of comp time because it was because the employees were driving the union in regards to they wanted to have that added flexibility. Whether it was one of our dispatchers working in communications or whatever, or one of our female deputies that they're planning on having a family. They wanted to have that flexibility to keep a paycheck coming in when they exhausted their sick time or vacation time. So I'm enthusiastic about this because I truly believe that it is strictly employee-driven. It's not employer-driven. I can't force you to do it because it's clear, I forget what section I wrote in, but it was pretty clear in regards to coercing, forcing, doing anything that could be seen as that, because right now if they don't get paid overtime, where do they go? If an employer violates this and says, you know what, I don't care about the 40 hours, you're going to work 45 hours, and that's the way it is, and I'm not going to pay you 5 hours overtime. Where do they go?
They go to either the court system or the Department of Labor, which is the exact same remedy under this amendment to the Fair Labor Standards Act that the employee would have if there was coercion or...
It's pretty clear about coercion. I mean, it wasn't like one word that you're going to be coerced. You remember what section it was?
Section 4.
4. It says, provides compensatory time under paragraph 1. Two employees shall not directly or indirectly be intimidated, threatened, coerced, or attempt to intimidate, threaten, or coerce any employee for the purpose of interfering with such person's rights.
Correct.
That's pretty clear. It's not ambiguous. It covers if you, or even if you try to, or even if, basically, if you think about it.
Correct.
Once again, maybe the ranking member sees that differently in 4, but, I mean, that seems like a pretty strong protection. It's not?
I mean, I'd be happy to respond. You're asking me a question.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, sure. If you look at the section of the bill, use of time, I mean, we're talking about flexibility. We're talking about comp time. So this is the section that really sets forth what the rules are for employees. Now, when you describe your own life experience, you talked about how the system changed to give the employee the complete control over when you exercised
Well,
time.
no,
That's what you said.
No,
We're laying out
what they
the
have,
chronology.
the ability to gain comp time. It's their choice, just like this bill is. But to use comp time, it's just like if I want to take a vacation and an employer gives you a vacation of 1 week. You can't, if you have a 10-man shop, you can't have all 10, maybe you do, but typically you're not going to have all 10, so the employer does set when you can take that vacation time.
And that's exactly what this says, is it's the employer's call in terms of whether or not you get to exercise that comp time. So when we're talking about, whether or not employees are being empowered by this bill or not, when the veto, the final decision is the employers, and the employers alone, under the language of this bill, then again, it just doesn't meet its billing in terms of the power that it's giving to people.
But then the employer is going to have to make that employee whole by paying him the time.
Sure, 6 months or a year, later. Okay, so and again, I would just say this: in the public sector, it's not like the public sector unions are having an epiphany about the fact that this comp time is so great. I mean, for the record, I have a letter from the AFSCME, which actually sets forth a lot of the litigation that they've had over this question of employers denying people comp time that they've earned. Now, again, in your case, you not only had a civil service commission, you also had a collective bargaining. Well, collective bargaining agreements apply almost universally in the public sector, so there's a grievance process.
But prior to that, we didn't.
Fine, but today they do. Okay, and so but when you're talking about enforcing people's rights, to say that state departments of labor are capable on a case-by-case basis of dealing with really tens of thousands of workplaces all across America, and is going to come up with a balanced, effective system to protect employees' rights is just really totally divorced from the reality of Department of Labor's wage and hour division.
I guess this is where we disagree, is the fact that the employee, though, drives whether or not they want to even get into a comp time situation, because it is very clear that all you have to do is have two employees hear the same conversation, and guess what? They're going to go to wage and hour, federal wage and hour.
So if an employer says, I need people to work overtime, one guy raises his hand and says, I'll do it with comp time, the other one says, I need the cash. Again, the employer doesn't say a word, doesn't say, as in Martha's scenario, I mean, she actually said the employer actually makes it a condition of the overtime that the person has to commit to comp time. If he just lays it out there, two people raise their hand, and one makes the choice for comp time, and over again, that person in that instance keeps getting picked. I mean, the fact of the matter is that it doesn't become voluntary. People get the message that they have to sacrifice their overtime in terms of getting comp time.
A couple of things. First of all, that agreement would already have to be in place prior to the accrual of the time. So it's the agreement would already exist, to Mr. Courtney's point. But then back to the first point, an employee, and this is subsection E of Section 6, I believe, no, Section 3. Written request. An employee may withdraw an agreement described in paragraph 2B at any time. An employee may also request in writing that monetary compensation be provided at any time for all compensatory time accrued that has not yet been used. So when Mr. Courtney said 6 months to a year, that's actually not correct under the plain language of this bill. It is at any time. And then it further says within 30 days of receiving the request, the employer shall provide the employee with the monetary compensation due in accordance with such paragraph. So if it is, let's say the employer says, I want to exercise this, I have the ability to exercise this, but the employer, there's some uncertainty with the type of business the employer has if they can necessarily make it work. And let's say there is some complications and it's a 10-man shop and everybody wants to use their comp time at one time and the employer can't accommodate because they're trying to put out a product and there's a demand for it, then the employee can say, I've accrued all this time, but this isn't working. Give me my overtime. And within 30 days of that request, that overtime at the higher of the two rates to what Mr. Woodall said, no matter what they were earning at the time that they accrued it, if their wages are higher at the time they request it, that is what they are paid out upon that request. That is a huge protection in this bill for the employee if some scenario, as Mr. Courtney has painted, were to happen.
Again, in order to get a week of comp time, it takes months to build that up. You don't do it in one pay period or two pay period. I mean, and you've been through this. I mean, it takes time to accrue that with overtime. So, in fact, it would be 6 months to a year before you'd ever sort of decide, well, this isn't working because my employer will never give me my comp time. And by then, you have lost 6 months to maybe even 12 months of time.
But I would think, though, if I'm going to work for comp time, just one last thing. If I'm going to agree to work for comp time, and for whatever reason, I mean, if I need the cash, I'm going to take the cash. If that's going to be the difference between myself making my car payment or not, I'm going to take the cash. But if I have the cushion that I'm looking to use that time, if I don't get the time, and this is what happened with us, if you don't get the time when you think you need it, and there's no overriding reason why you shouldn't get it, then guess what? You'll never, as an employee, will never operate under that comp time guise again because you couldn't get the time when you needed it. But what I like about this is that in most organizations, to get that comp time, you have to quit to get paid. Here you can just request it, which is outstanding because most places, even today, even union shops, the way you get paid is you leave the employment of the agency and they'll pay you upon, because that is a requirement of fair labor and standards.
Well, and you're right, and I just want to say this is about flexibility and about choice. This is about the dad that wants to coach his son's t-ball game that takes only 1 hour out of his week, and he might not need to accrue, 40 or 50 hours to take an entire week off for a vacation. He might just want to enter into agreement, whereas he caps out at, 10 hours because there's only 10 weeks in the t-ball.
We had dads that wanted to take FMLA because of, the birth of a son or a daughter. They wanted to be there to help with their wife. This just gives, I think, gives people the flexibility to be responsible for what they do and to help them through tough times if they need it. And if it doesn't work, then they don't have to participate in it. So I thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with this great bill. I think it's an awesome piece of legislation that's been brought forward. From my own experience, I too had employees in the state of Florida that worked for me, 750 employees that worked for the Florida House of Representatives, and they served at my pleasure. And I don't know a single one ever that did not choose comp time over overtime pay. Not one. Why? It was a recruiting tool. It was a great benefit to have that option. And it's an option that I used as I would tell people about it. When we were trying to hire somebody, we say, look, here's what you can do. Yes, the legislature adjourned sine die here last Friday. There was a lot to do up until that point. After that, it's like you drop off a cliff, and there's nothing to do in the summer. And the staff accrued lots and lots of hours of time, and now they're going to take it, and it's going to benefit them. And they can go off on whatever vacation they want to do, and they can do it at their own leisure time. But those were not covered by union. The rest of our state employees are. ASME is our AFL-CIO is the union that represents them, and I have right here the rule regarding hours and overtime, which is governed by a Rule 60L-34 Florida Administrative Code, and it basically it sounds like this bill. I just want to make sure. First of all, it says that those that are eligible for overtime may. Is that true? This is a may.
Yes, completely voluntary.
Yes. And it is 1.5 hours credit for every hour worked in overtime. Is that correct?
That's correct.
These are credits, just as Mr. Woodall carefully explained. These are credits of hours, not dollars. So when you cash in, no matter when that is, you get the wage, the highest wage you were making during that period of time.
That's
True?
the higher of what you either accrued it or at the time what you're making at the time you cash out.
Right.
Correct.
And then it's capped in that you can only accrue so many hours. Is that correct?
Yes, under this bill, it's 160 hours of compensatory time.
And then it takes mutual agreement to cash those in, to use them.
No, that's actually incorrect. It is only at the option of the employee. The employee can opt out, cash out at any time. The employer can also cash out, but only anything above 80 hours of banked
Thank you for
overtime.
making that clear, because that's the way it is in Florida, too. So all of these things you've said, plus the fact it's in our particular case, it says it can be June 30th, which is the end of our fiscal year, December 31st, or any other time within a year period of time that's negotiated between the employee and the employer. Is that the way yours is?
That's correct. As long as it's a 12-month period, on the last day of the 12 months, what was decided upon, then that employer then has 30 days from that date in order to pay the employee for any unused compensatory.
Yes, so it's not use it or lose it. It's when you get to that end of that year and you haven't found a time that was mutually acceptable, then you're going to get cash for that.
That is correct.
So currently, you get no comp time. And so you can't take that time off. And there's no negotiating except that the employer says, yeah, you can have time off, but it's going to be without pay or so forth. That may work out. But you can't get that now. With this, let's assume the same thing happens. You can't come to an agreement. In either case, you get paid the full amount.
That is correct. At the higher wage that you were earning at that time that you asked for it than at the time that you earned it.
Great. Well, Mr. Chairman, just like I said, this is a recruiting tool. There is not, and I will say this, I don't know one state employee who was employed by the legislature, or I don't know one state employee who was under union contract that did not take comp time in lieu of pay. Not one. Because they love it. It is an awesome thing. So yes, you can have family leave, and there's certain criteria to get to that point, and you get time off, but you don't get paid. This one you get paid.
If it's good enough for them, why shouldn't it be good enough for the private sector?
Absolutely. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Chairman is aware that we're on votes at this time, and I would like to ask the committee please to stay in place so that we can finish our work, and so I appreciate both of our witnesses doing the same. Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Congresswoman Roby because she is a terrific representative of what America's working families are all about. She's made a great sacrifice to her family to come up here and serve the people of her district in Alabama, even though she's got 2 young children. How old are they? I feel like I've grown up. We've been seeing them grow up.
You have Margaret is now 8 as of last Friday, and George is 4.
8 and 4. And this is so terrific that you're going to leave them with this wonderful, wonderful bill as a legacy of what you've done. And I think you're a wonderful representative of what working families all around the United States are doing. Many, of course, don't have this wonderful job that we're so privileged and so humbled to have, and they're working in factories, and they're working at banks, and they're working at really tough jobs to make ends meet. And more than anything, they want to be home with their families. And this is what your bill is all about. And cut out all of those talking points. This is really a bill to make working families work, to make it available to balance, and it's so difficult for our working families to have that balance. And as my colleague Danny pointed out, that's what moms and dads want. They want the time to stay at home with their kids. They want the flexibility to be able to have a wonderful job. They don't want to sacrifice that, but they want to have time with their kids as well. And I want to thank you for the sacrifice that you make for America's families, and as you say, it's good enough for one group, but it's not good enough for another group. That just doesn't make American sense. And their employee says, no, you can't be with your family, but this is a real simple bill. It's a family-friendly bill. It's what it really speaks to working moms and dads. And my colleague from Massachusetts, my good friend, Mr. McGovern, he says, we're not doing anything to help people. Holy Toledo, this is a bill that really helps people. And this is exactly what this bill does. Yet some partisan groups may look at this and say this is a bad idea, but they look at it just as a partisan issue because it is a good idea. And a good idea, even from a rascal, is a good idea nonetheless. And you're no rascal. You're a pretty good lady. So, but if it's good enough for the unions, by gum, it's good enough for the private sector. So I want to thank you, Martha Roby, because I think you're representative of so many working moms and dads around our country who think that we don't get it up here. You get it, and you're helping us to get it too. So thank you so much, Martha Roby. Plus, she's a heck of a softball player. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the chairwoman very much. In the spirit of some levity around here, Dr. Burgess, if you'd like, I'll give you comp time if you'll keep your time short, and would be willing to work out that arrangement.
No pressure, no pressure.
We can make the arrangement here. Gentleman's recognized. Dr. Burgess.
I just want to say that I think this is a common sense piece of legislation. I'm happy to support it. I'm a little bit mystified when I read the Statement of Administration Policy, but let's be honest, if the President's senior advisors are against it, it just strengthens my resolve to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you for taking time to come up before this committee today. We believe that your expertise and you appearing before the committee bettered our ability and the American public's understanding of what we're trying to do here. Congratulations to both of you. Mrs. Roby, we'll be supporting your bill, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're now excused. Chairman will be in receipt of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, before I make the motion, I'd like to compliment Congresswoman Roby also for her wonderful actions here today. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 1406, the Working Families Flexibility Act of 2013, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Education and Workforce. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Education and Workforce, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended, makes in order only the further amendment printed in the Rules Committee report. If offered by Representative Gibson of New York or his designee, the amendment shall be considered as read, shall be separately debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
I thank the gentlewoman from North Carolina. The chairman recognizes that during the hearing there were some additional changes that took place, including amendments that perhaps would have gone before the committee. In fact, the committee did hear testimony from anyone who requested the opportunity to be here today, and I appreciate the gentlewoman. I'd now like to ask the gentlewoman if she'd like to explain the rule.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a structured rule. It provides for 1 hour debate. The rule makes in order only one amendment sponsored by Republicans. The committee received 6 other amendments, but 3 were withdrawn and 3 were non-germane. All of the germane amendments were made in order, and this is a very fair rule.
You've now heard the discussion by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Is there any amendment or discussion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 1406 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the floor.
Yes, sir. Does the gentleman wish to have a discussion about that?
Yeah, no, Mr. Chairman, I guess the supposed openness of this Congress is to allow us to have one amendment on a GAO study. And, given the fact this bill is going nowhere, you might as well give it an open rule and let people be able to deliberate on this and offer their ideas. But, I mean, this notion that some of this is a fair rule because we allow one amendment in order, a GAO study, I mean, this has to be challenged, and I support the gentlelady's amendment.
I appreciate the discussion. So the committee is aware of this. We, at the Rules Committee, have had numerous discussions with members about amendments, about the way to craft amendments, about the way that we would accept amendments, and in fact, I advised the gentlewoman from New York that we would be accepting one of those amendments. It was pulled. It was requested that we not make that amendment in order at this time, and so we are moving forward with what we had. We had a very open process. Mrs. Roby has been very open about this. The Congress has been open, and so I would seek a no vote.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, gentleman's right.
We could easily have an open rule that makes in order all germane amendments.
I appreciate the feedback from the gentleman, and I certainly want you to know that I always will consider that not only an option, but this committee would be able to make a quick judgment about that. And
but not
today,
time, right? Okay.
Well, today we were hoping that we would have had another amendment that would have been made in order, and it was my idea to talk with the gentlewoman and told her before the hearing started that, in fact, our intent was to do that, and then the gentleman who's the author of that amendment decided to withdraw that amendment. Those in favor of the Slaughter amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. The noes have it.
Roll call.
Roll call.
Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Ross-Leitman? No. Ms. Ross-Leitman, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report.
3 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments or discussion? Seeing none, those in favor of the motion by the gentlewoman from North Carolina will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
And the ayes prevail. The ayes prevail. I want to thank the committee for being here today. We will have Mrs. Fox will be the manager of the amendment for the Republicans.
Mr. Polis?
And Mr. Polis will represent Democrats. Please be advised that we will meet tomorrow at 3 o'clock on the debt limit prioritization bill. The committee is now excused.